He was only 2 years old, strapped inside a cardboard box on the floor of a military cargo plane. The engines roared, the sky held steady, and then the rear door blew open. This is the story of Flight C.5A Galaxy and the babies who fell from the sky. It was April 1975. The final days of the Vietnam War were not marked by silence. They were marked by panic. In the streets of Saigon, people rushed with bundles in their arms and fear in their eyes. In the skies above, the sound of departing engines had begun to mean only one thing: escape. Among the chaos, a different kind of mission was quietly unfolding. A mission not of soldiers, but of children. The United States had launched what it called Operation Babylift, a massive evacuation effort to airlift thousands of Vietnamese orphans out of the country. The goal was to bring them to safety, to give them new homes in America, Australia, Europe, to turn them into symbols of hope in a war that had run out of reasons. It sounded noble. It looked noble. But behind the headlines, the truth was more complicated. Some of the children were true orphans. Others had parents who, fearing what the future held, had made the impossible choice to send them away. In the rush to evacuate, records were lost, consent was assumed, and identities blurred into paperwork. What mattered was volume. What mattered was speed. And so, the first aircraft was prepared. A Lockheed C.5.A Galaxy, tail number 6.80.2.1.8. It wasn't a passenger plane. It was one of the largest military transport aircraft in the world, designed to carry tanks, armored vehicles, missile systems, not infants. But on that day, it carried 3.1.4 souls. 229 of them were children. Most of them were under the age of 5. They were loaded into the aircraft in rows of makeshift cradles. Some were placed inside cardboard boxes, padded with blankets. There were no seats for them, no harnesses. Many didn't even have names pinned to their clothes. The upper deck was filled to capacity with babies and nurses. The lower cargo deck was reserved for older children, embassy staff, photographers, and volunteers. In total, 85 adults. Some were medical personnel. Others were members of the U.S. Air Force crew. None of them knew what would happen next. The aircraft would take off from Tan Son Nhut Air Base, climb eastward over the South China Sea, then stop to refuel at Clark Air Base in the Philippines, before continuing on to Travis Air Force Base in California. It was meant to be the first of many flights, a symbol of compassion and closure. At 4:03 p.m. local time on the 4th of April, Flight C.5A Galaxy rose into the sky. It was carrying hundreds of promises, none of them guaranteed to land. The aircraft climbed steadily, its engines rumbling deep beneath the floor, a low vibration that settled into the bones of everyone on board. From the cockpit, the skies ahead were calm, patches of white cloud scattered like broken fabric across a pale blue horizon. Below them, the shoreline of Vietnam slipped away, almost unnoticed. Inside, it was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes not from peace, but from caution. Most of the children had fallen asleep. Some stirred. A few whimpered, restless in their makeshift beds. Nurses moved gently between them, adjusting blankets, checking pulses, whispering names that might not have been their own. There were no overhead bins, no seatback trays, just the steel ribs of a military transport and the weight of too many lives carried in its hold. Captain Dennis Traynor sat at the controls, 30 years old, composed, experienced. To his right, First Lieutenant Theodore Ford. Behind them, the flight engineer, Master Sergeant Alan Leland. Together, they had reviewed their route, monitored weather reports, double-checked fuel loads. Everything had been routine, but nothing about this flight was routine. At 4:15 p.m., flight C.5.A Galaxy reached its cruising altitude of 23,000 feet. The aircraft was now 30 kilometers southeast of Vung Tau, heading east over open water. For a few brief minutes, everything held. The instruments were stable, the engines strong, the air still. Then a sound, not an explosion, not at first. It was more like a pressure shift, a sudden, violent gasp, a noise that came not from outside but from within. In the rear of the aircraft, the massive cargo door failed. The force of decompression was immediate, instant. The aft ramp, nearly 5 meters wide, blew open. Air roared out of the fuselage. The temperature plummeted. Fog rushed in as oxygen vanished from the pressurized cabin. People closest to the rear were gone, lifted, dragged, torn into the sky. The aircraft shook violently. Warning lights erupted on the flight engineer's panel, red across the board. In the cockpit, Captain Trainer struggled to regain control. But something was wrong. The yoke moved, but the tail no longer responded. They had lost 2 of the aircraft's 4 hydraulic systems. With them went the rudder, the elevators, the stabilizers. The C.5.A was no longer flying. It was floating, unbalanced, vulnerable. Down below, panic took hold. Children were screaming. Oxygen masks, few and far between, dangled uselessly from the ceiling. Most weren't designed for infants. Those that were had been improperly secured. In the lower deck, unsecured cargo crashed forward. Crates struck walls. Equipment snapped from its mountings. People shouted through the noise, their voices thin against the roar of the wind. A loadmaster, crawling toward the breach in the rear, managed to radio the cockpit. His voice was ragged. He confirmed what the pilots already feared: structural damage, hydraulic failure, a hole in the body of the aircraft, large enough to swallow a truck. Captain Trainer didn't panic. Not outwardly. He didn't have time. He called for an immediate descent, 10,000 feet, the minimum altitude where breathable air could be sustained without masks. As they dropped, Lieutenant Ford reached for the radio, his hands shaking. He contacted Tan Son Nhut, voice clipped, measured, more control than fear. "We have an emergency. Request immediate return. Hull breach." The reply came quickly. The runway was being cleared, but turning back, that would not be simple. With no rudder, no elevators, the pilots were left with only one way to maneuver the aircraft: throttle control, differential thrust. By increasing power on one side and reducing it on the other, they could nudge the plane into a gradual turn. It was slow, crude, dangerous, and it was working. Bit by bit, the giant aircraft banked left. Somewhere in the fuselage, a child stopped crying. The quiet that followed was not comforting. From 23,000 feet, flight C.5A Galaxy began to fall. Not in a plunge, but in a long, aching slide. The sky no longer held them. Only momentum did. And gravity waits for no one. The aircraft had turned. Barely. The left engines pushed harder, the right throttled back. Each adjustment came with a delay, a slow, uncertain response that forced the crew to anticipate what might happen before it did. There were no instruments to guide them now. The tail had stopped speaking. The C.5A Galaxy was gliding through memory and momentum, and not much else. Captain Trainer glanced once at the altimeter. It was falling as expected. 18,000 feet. then 17. But the rate wasn't clean. It wasn't smooth. The nose dipped, then lifted, then dipped again. A cycle. A rhythm that didn't belong to the pilots, but to physics. This was phugoid oscillation. A ghostly rocking, back and forth. The aircraft had become too large, too wounded, to remain still. Without stabilizers, it pitched up and down in slow, lurching waves. The crew had studied this phenomenon in theory, but theory does little to prepare you for what it feels like when the world rises and falls beneath your hands. Inside, the children felt it too. Some had stopped crying altogether. The noise of the wind, the cold, the sudden weightlessness in each dip of the aircraft. It had silenced them. Nurses clung to anything solid. Some crawled inch by inch to check pulses, to hold tiny hands. There were no instructions for this. No training that covered how to comfort an infant while the sky collapses around you. At 10,000 feet, the cabin began to stabilize. There was still no real control, but the worst of the pressure drop had passed. Breath returned, thin but enough. The coast of Vietnam appeared ahead in the distance, a faded line between sea and land. And beyond that, just barely visible through the haze, the runways of Tan Son Nhut. The plane was still in the air, somehow, but it was not gliding toward safety. It was descending into uncertainty. Every second, the weight of the aircraft grew more pronounced. Fuel burned away, but it wasn't enough to lighten the load. The cargo deck remained full. Bodies, equipment, memory, all of it pressing down. And the closer they came to land, the more the aircraft fought against itself. At 4,000 feet, they leveled, temporarily. The pilots tried to lock their heading, no small task without a functioning rudder. Below them, the edges of Saigon blurred into flooded fields, canals, narrow roads. There was no room for error, no chance to circle. They would have one shot at this landing. They called in their position, 9 kilometers from the runway, aligned but high. Speed, too fast. They had no flaps, no speed brakes, nothing to slow their descent except drag, gravity, and friction waiting below. Captain Trainer leaned forward. Gear down! The wheels extended, but the noise that followed wasn't reassuring. A deep, mechanical groan echoed through the floor. Something strained, then held. For now, inside the lower cargo deck, one of the flight medics braced herself against the wall. Her shoulder was dislocated. Her hands were blistered from crawling over exposed metal. But she didn't cry. She didn't stop. Her job was simple now. Keep the children awake, keep them warm, keep them breathing. She repeated their names, even if she didn't know if they were right. One child looked up at her and smiled. At 3,000 feet, the aircraft began its final approach. The runway was ahead, waiting, but the descent was no longer stable. At this speed, with no elevator control, the aircraft couldn't hold its angle. It began to sink, too fast. Captain Trainer pulled power. The aircraft lifted slightly, not enough. Lieutenant Ford nudged the left throttle. The nose dipped again. They were fighting physics with engines. The plane's body began to shudder, a vibration that ran from nose to tail. It was the airframe protesting, against speed, against strain, against the impossible task it had been given. Then, a thud. Not a crash, not yet. Just the first contact with something solid. The wheels had grazed a flooded rice paddy. For a moment, the earth had caught them. But not fully. The C.5.A lifted once more, skipping over the wet field like a stone across water. And then, it fell. What came next was silence, torn wide open. The second impact was not something that could be measured by instruments. It wasn't logged in the flight data recorder or plotted on a descent chart. It was felt. It began as a tremor, a ripple that moved through the belly of the aircraft, then grew violently, rapidly, until the entire airframe buckled. The landing gear, already strained, gave way. The nose pitched downward, and the C.5.A Galaxy, one of the largest aircraft ever built, began to break. Not all at once. First, the rear fuselage split from the center, peeling away at the seams. Then the floor collapsed. Cargo restraints snapped, steel twisted, fuel lines tore open, sparks followed, then flame. Inside, time no longer moved in seconds. It expanded, stretched, became fragments. Some remember the sound first. A deep, cracking roar, not from outside but from beneath. Others remember silence, a still moment before impact, when the world seemed to hold its breath. A nurse later recalled hearing a baby's laugh, clear, piercing, just seconds before everything went dark. The aircraft slid for nearly a quarter of a mile across soaked earth. It passed over another paddy, struck the edge of a low embankment, then lifted again, briefly, before crashing into the far side of a dike. The forward section nosed down. The center tore apart, and the fire, now unchecked, surged forward. There was no time to scream. In the upper deck, the crew cabin remained partially intact. Against all odds, the cockpit windows held. The instrument panel was crushed, but behind it, Traynor, Ford, Leland were still alive. They moved slowly, through smoke, through pain, through disbelief. The smell of burned plastic filled their lungs. The floor beneath them had shifted. The front landing gear was gone. The plane now rested in mud, tilted, bleeding. They forced open the emergency hatch. Sunlight cut through the haze. Outside, the field was strangely quiet. There was no crowd, no sirens, just scattered debris, pools of fuel, broken metal, and the soft hiss of fire finding oxygen. Survivors emerged in pieces, one by one, stumbling, dragging, carrying. A flight attendant with a broken arm pulled 2 children from the wreckage. A medical technician, her face burned, passed out after lifting a boy to safety. A Vietnamese villager barefoot arrived before the rescue teams. He carried water in a tin basin and gave it to a girl who didn't speak. There were no instructions, no coordinated response, just instinct and grief. In the lower deck, the fire had moved fast. Too fast. Most never had a chance to stand. The cargo ramp, blown mid-flight, had left the space exposed. And when the fuel ignited, it became a furnace. The official numbers would later confirm it. Of the 314 people on board, 138 had died. 78 of them were children. But numbers do not speak. They do not scream or whisper or ask why. On that field, in the heat of what remained, names were still unknown. Some had no tags. Others had tags, but no records. The chaos of war had taken what the fire had not. It took hours before helicopters could land. The ground was too soft. Flames still burned. Wreckage blocked the approach. Crews rappelled in, carrying stretchers, morphine, radios. One nurse refused evacuation. She had 3rd-degree burns across her arms. But she stayed, helped carry children to the edge of the paddies, waited for the rotor blades to return. She collapsed only after the last child had been loaded. Later, when they asked her why, she simply said, "They were still breathing." By nightfall, the fire was out. The C.5.A Galaxy, tail number 6.80.218, was gone. But something stayed behind. A weight, a shadow, a silence that settled into the mud, into the trees, into the lungs of those who had walked through smoke and metal and found something that resembled life on the other side. In the weeks that followed, the field grew quiet again. The fire was gone, the wreckage removed, but the weight of what had happened remained. It clung to the earth, not as sound, but as something heavier, an imprint. Grass refused to grow where the fuselage had torn open. The villagers who'd arrived first spoke softly when they passed the place. Some never walked that path again. Back in the Philippines at Clark Air Base, investigators examined what little had been recovered. Not much was left intact. Most of the rear section had been destroyed. The black boxes, scorched but functional, were flown to the United States. Inside them were voices, calm, focused, strained recordings of men trying to hold a falling aircraft together with nothing but throttles and instinct. But the answers they found weren't in the voices. They were in the door. It took weeks to confirm what the engineers already suspected. The aft cargo ramp had failed. Not because of sabotage, not because of enemy fire, but because the locks that held it shut didn't. Some of the latches, used to keep the door sealed under pressure, had been removed during maintenance. Others had been reinstalled, but improperly. Documentation was missing. Signatures skipped. One technician admitted later they had been in a hurry. The war was ending. There weren't enough parts. No one thought the next flight would be the last. They'd checked the systems, but not the locks. At altitude, with the cabin pressurized, the faulty mechanism held for a time. But pressure builds, always. And when the final lock failed, the door didn't just open. It tore away. And with it, so did the stability of the plane. The investigation concluded with words that have since become familiar: improper maintenance, procedural oversight, systemic failure, each of them accurate, none of them sufficient. There were calls to ground the fleet, temporary suspensions, upgrades to the locking systems, but the aircraft continued to fly, the war continued to end, and the children were buried, some in Vietnam, others in Thailand. A few repatriated to the U.S., though many were never identified, their names lost or mismatched or never recorded at all. The ones who survived grew up in faraway cities, Detroit, Sydney, Marseille. Some were adopted. Some were moved through homes and programs. As they grew older, questions began to follow them. Who were their parents? Why had they been on that plane? Were they meant to leave? Were they ever meant to come back? Some began to search. Decades later, a woman in Australia, one of the infants pulled from the wreckage, matched her DNA with a man living in central Vietnam. He had been searching for his daughter since 1975. When he saw her photo, he cried without speaking. They had no common language, only blood. Another survivor, now a teacher in California, visited the crash site on the 50th anniversary. She stood in the rice field, quiet, holding a photo of the nurse who had carried her to safety. A woman she never met again. A woman whose name she never knew. These were the other wounds, the ones that didn't burn, the ones that didn't leave scars on skin, but under it. Flight C.5.A Galaxy, tail number 6.8-0.218, never finished its journey, but its passengers did. Not all at once, not with certainty, but over time in pieces. Some found family. Some found silence. Some are still searching. And in the space where the plane once fell, there is only stillness now. But if you listen long enough, you can still hear the sound of engines climbing, trying to return.